There is arguably no other class of criminal that is elevated to folk hero status as often as the bank robber. Whether their stories are told in fictionalized accounts in our television, books, and movies, or in real time as they are covered by the media, it seems that none of us can get enough of a good heist story. If you've been following our channel for a while, you know that we've already covered a few of these kinds of stories in an earlier video about iconic heists. However, today we wanted to narrow our focus, taking a look specifically at some of the largest bank robberies ever to take place in the United States. For this video, we're going to be focusing wherever possible on robberies that took place at commercial banks, so heists that targeted armored cars and other facilities warehousing cash and valuables will not be considered. We should also note that we are ranking these robberies in inflation-adjusted dollars rather than their cash value at the time they took place, for a more equal comparison. Before we get to our list, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. With that out of the way, here are 6 of the largest US bank robberies. On the morning of January 14th, 1998, Richie Gillette, Melvin Folk, and Mike Reed entered the North Tower of the World Trade Center, carrying duffel bags. Using ID badges that had been given to them by one of the building's employees, they were able to bypass security, after which they boarded a passenger elevator to the 11th floor. The men were headed for the Bank of America Currency Exchange Center, which was due to receive a large shipment of cash just after 8:30 that morning. When they got to the 11th floor, they put on ski masks and waited by the freight elevator for employees to arrive with the money. When the shipment arrived, Gillette, Folk, and Reed managed to catch the employees off guard, holding them at gunpoint while they tied them up and began stealing the cash. When they were finished, they sent the freight elevator up to the 22nd floor, which was vacant due to construction at the time. Meanwhile, the robbers headed back down on the passenger elevator and exited the building at 8:45. They had stolen an estimated $1.6 million in cash, roughly $2.5 million today when adjusted for inflation. Though the robbery seemingly went off without a hitch, all 3 men were quickly captured. Unbeknownst to them, they had removed their masks too early and had walked past several hidden security cameras, which were used to identify them. Folk and Reed were each captured within a day of the robbery, while Gillette was captured on January 16th. Believing that the 3 robbers were not the masterminds behind the heist, investigators eventually found their way to a man named Ralph Guarino. Guarino was a mobster who had used his connections to help plan critical details of the crime, such as securing ID badges so the men could get past security. In order to receive a lighter sentence, Guarino would later agree to become an FBI informant to help bring down a New Jersey mob family. By the time they robbed the Seafirst Bank in Lakewood, Washington, the crimes of Billy Kirkpatrick and Ray Bowman were already well known to investigators. Though they did not yet know the men's names, the FBI had dubbed them the Trenchcoat Robbers, notorious thieves who were responsible for at least 26 bank heists throughout the 1980s and 90s. On February 10, 1997, the Trenchcoat Robbers would pull off their biggest score yet. However, it would also be their last. Kirkpatrick and Bowman spent weeks casing the bank and devising getaway plans before going through with the robbery. They lived in a nearby motel for most of January, taking in the local sights and making frequent trips to the scene of the crime. On the day of the heist, they showed up just as bank employees were preparing to leave for the day. As 3 tellers turned off the lights and began to lock the vault, Kirkpatrick and Bowman pried open the main doors to the bank and entered. They were wearing their trademark trench coats, as well as sunglasses and FBI caps. The 2 men proceeded into the vault, holding the employees at gunpoint and restraining their wrists with plastic zip ties. After that, they hastily began stuffing money into duffel bags. In just a few minutes, they had wheeled a large stack of bags to their car and made their getaway. In all, the men had escaped with almost $4.5 million, a sum that would be worth more than $7 million adjusted for inflation today. Though the robbery was successful, it was the massive size of the score that ultimately turned out to be the men's downfall. The amount of cash was so large that it was hard for Kirkpatrick and Bowman to store properly. Before the end of the year, Kirkpatrick would be caught after a roadside traffic stop revealed the presence of $2 million in a set of footlockers in his vehicle. Bowman would make the mistake of giving a large lump sum payment to a home builder, which attracted the attention of the IRS. In both cases, the money was quickly traced back to the Seafirst Bank. By 1999, both men had been convicted of the robbery and sentenced to more than 15 years in prison. In April of 1981, several masked men pulled off what was the largest cash robbery in U.S. history at the time, at the First National Bank of Arizona. While janitor Charles Virgil waited for the bank's doors to be opened that morning, he was ambushed by the men and held at gunpoint. The men then waited for bank manager John Granger to arrive, ambushing him too once he had disabled the building's alarms. Both Granger and Virgil were told that if they did not cooperate, they would be killed, and that several accomplices were also waiting at their homes to kill their families. It was evident that the robbers had done their homework. Not only did they know the nicknames of their two hostages, they knew that the vault of the First National Bank would be especially full that morning. First National had received deposits from several municipal banks the night before and had millions in cash on hand. After forcing Granger to give them access to the vault, the men stuffed the money into several bags and loaded up their getaway vehicle. The entire robbery lasted less than 20 minutes, and both Granger and Virgil were left unharmed. The thieves managed to get away with roughly $3.3 million in cash, which translates to well over $9 million in today's money. Unlike almost all of the other cases on this list, most of the culprits in the First National Bank robbery actually got away with their crime, though eventually served time for other heists. Douglas Bruce Fenimore was the only one of the men who was ever officially convicted of the First National robbery, and though he implicated two other men, David Lee Grandstaff and Douglas Wayne Brown, both were later acquitted by a jury. When Fenimore was caught, roughly $900,000 of the gang's haul was also found. The rest of the money has never been recovered. It has been almost 100 years since the robbery of the Lincoln National Bank took place, but the crime remains shrouded in rumor and mystery. At approximately 10 a.m. on the morning of September 17, 1930, a stolen Buick sedan carrying 6 men pulled up to the main entrance of the bank. 5 of the men exited the vehicle and headed towards the building's doors. While one of the men stayed watch outside of the bank with a machine gun, the other 4 entered, proceeding to take control of the building's main floor. After that, 3 of the men proceeded to the bank's lower level, where the vault was located. Though they could not gain access to the vault's main safe, they were able to take any cash that was in sight, as well as hundreds of thousands more in securities and other valuables. While the bank was being robbed, a police officer on patrol was alerted to the crime. Realizing that his revolver was no match for the robber's machine gun, he ran back to the station to get backup. By the time he had returned to the bank 5 minutes later, the robbers had made their getaway. The heist put the community on high alert, and a search was quickly conducted to try to track down the men's getaway vehicle. At one point, 2 planes were even used to search the surrounding area, but no one was able to track down the gang of thieves. In all, the robbers were able to make off with roughly $2.5 million in stolen cash, securities, and valuables, a sum that would total almost $39 million if adjusted for inflation. The ensuing public panic actually caused the Lincoln National Bank to be sold to a competitor, following a mass withdrawal of funds from the bank by anxious depositors who no longer felt that their money was safe. At the same time, police scrambled to identify the perpetrators as public pressure mounted. This eventually led to the arrest of 3 men, Thomas O'Connor, Howard Lee, and John Jack Britt. Relying exclusively on the testimony of a couple of witnesses, all 3 men were tried the following year, and O'Connor and Lee were convicted. Britt was tried twice, but the jury remained deadlocked in both cases, and he was subsequently released. Though it was later discovered that none of the men were likely involved in the robbery, O'Connor and Lee would serve 10 years of their 25-year sentences before being released on parole. Their names were never officially cleared. It is believed that prejudicial media coverage at the time heavily contributed to the convictions. Around the time of the trials, rumors began to spread about the involvement of organized crime in the robbery. A man named Gus Winkler, who had known ties to Al Capone, was later arrested and agreed to tip police off to the location of some of the stolen securities if charges were dropped against him. Investigators agreed and ultimately recovered $584,000 worth of the securities that had been taken during the robbery. However, it remains unknown whether Winkler was actually involved in the crime, or simply obtain the stolen goods from the real perpetrators after the fact. Several years later, the FBI released a list of men they believed were actually behind the iconic heist, though it is not clear whether any of the men were ever charged in connection with the case. Aside from being one of the biggest heists in US history, the United California bank robbery is also famous for its larger-than-life backstory. According to heist leader Emil Dincio, the crime was motivated by a tip he got from associates of legendary teamster Jimmy Hoffa. Dincio was told that there were millions of dollars in secret cash and valuables being held in the United California Bank in Laguna Niguel. The money was said to be an illicit campaign slush fund belonging to then-President Richard Nixon. Dincio and his brother James were career bank robbers from Youngstown, Ohio, who were experienced in disabling alarm systems and using explosives to gain access to bank vaults. Along with Dincio's nephews Harry and Ronald Barber and his brother-in-law Charles Mulligan, they meticulously planned the heist to take place in the spring of 1972. However, Dincio was also forced to make 2 last-minute additions to his crew, when the person who tipped him off about the money insisted that Phil Christopher and Charles Brockell also accompany the men. Brockell in particular had no actual skills the robbers could use and was simply brought along as muscle. On March 24, 1972, the Dincio crew made their way onto the United California's roof. After cutting a hole and exposing the top of the vault below, they systematically lowered in their equipment. From there, the men drilled holes into the vault's concrete, which they filled with explosives. Sacks of dirt were placed on top to muffle the noise of the explosion. Once the thieves had gained access to the vault, they spent the next 2 nights emptying out hundreds of safety deposit boxes. It took bank employees until late the following Monday morning to even realize they had been robbed. Though the actual heist was executed well, it didn't take long for authorities to track down the Dincio crew. A few months later, most of the men were caught after they committed a similar crime back in Ohio, and the FBI was able to connect the 2 cases. Fingerprints found back at the apartment the men had used as a headquarters for the California robbery eventually led to the arrest and conviction of the rest of them. Investigators were also aided by Brockell, who turned state's witness and testified against the other men. While it is not known exactly how much was taken during the United California bank robbery, most estimates put the value of the stolen cash and other items somewhere between $9 to $12 million. In today's money, that amounts to somewhere between $56 and $74 million. Of all of the stories on this list, the 1878 robbery of the Manhattan Savings Institution is perhaps the most sensational. Even more amazing than the amount of money taken during the heist was its location. The bank was considered one of the most impregnable in the world at the time, and housed the wealth of some of the 19th century's most iconic individuals, including Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller. The perpetrators behind the heist were no less impressive. The brains behind the robbery, George Leslie, was an architect turned criminal mastermind who used his skills to meticulously plan and practice robberies, utilizing techniques that would later become staples of Hollywood heist movies. He would construct blueprints from memory, build replicas of bank vaults, and rehearse crimes with his gang down to the finest details. According to law enforcement at the time, between 1869 and 1878, Leslie was responsible for either planning or carrying out more than 80% of the bank robberies in the country. It reportedly took Leslie more than 3 years to plan the robbery of the Manhattan Savings Institution. However, just 5 months before he could execute his plan, another of his obsessions ended up costing him his life. Leslie was known to be a womanizer, and was not particularly concerned with whether the women he slept with were married or single. It is thought that he was murdered by a member of his gang named Shang Draper, whose wife had been one of the many people he'd had an affair with. After Leslie's murder, his gang decided to go ahead with the plan. After obtaining access to the building by bribing one of the bank's watchmen, the gang, led by a man named Jimmy Hope, forced the night janitor to open the door to the main vault. They then used safe-cracking techniques pioneered by George Leslie to open the vault door, gaining access to almost $3 million worth of cash and securities. The thieves left quietly through the bank's back door, taking their score with them. Though all of the men responsible were later tracked down, the brazen robbery remains one of the most iconic in American history. Adjusted for inflation, the total value of the stolen goods would be over $70 million today. That brings us to the end of our list. Are there any other cases like this that you'd like us to keep in mind for a future video? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thank you for watching.